Despite global challenges, this year's report shows respondents have high confidence in their compliance programs. When asked why organizations feel this way, Associate Managing Director Michael Watt shared insights.
Organizations are feeling particularly confident despite all the challenges in the world. More than 60% of organizations globally are using internal audits and risk assessments. This is great to see because the best way to measure effectiveness is by proving that your organization is effective. Although at least from my view, I can see that if you're only confident about your organization because you don't have any issues, but yet you're not conducting risk assessments or internal audits, that may lead to a false sense of security. It's like if you feel confident that your car runs well because you haven't broken down on the highway yet. But yet you're not changing your oil or conducting annual maintenance. That doesn't mean that your car won't break down in the future. So in summary, organizations are both confident because they're proving their own effectiveness through the use of internal audits and risk assessments.
Third-party risks are high, probably because of the long-term effects from the pandemic and supply chain disruption. Associate Managing Director Vera Folan had more on clients' third-party risks in Europe.
There is a term I've heard quite a lot, mostly in the diversity, equity, and inclusion context, but that could apply here to third-party risk management. It's the notion of intersectionality. I think what's interesting is that when you talk about third-party risk management and what we see our clients do now, they have to address not only the usual anti-bribery and corruption risks that they were dealing with already under the context of the FCPA, for instance. They are also dealing with having an appropriate response to sanction risks, especially since February, of course, this year, with an acceleration of sanctions. So what's interesting is in the survey results, we saw that a number of respondents in Europe considered their third-party risks had increased depending on the countries. For instance, in Germany, around supply chain. So Germany has been really affected by the situation in Ukraine, and especially with regards to supply chain elements. And this was rated in the survey responses as an element that showed that third-party risks have increased for German companies.
Implementing environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, unified standards in ABC programs remains a challenge due to limited data, lack of standardization, limited transparency, and the variety of regulations. Associate Managing Director Vera Folan answers the question, what factors are critical to ensure that ESG is meeting the expectations within an anti-bribery and corruption program?
What remains a challenge to ESG in anti-bribery and corruption programs is the difficulty to implement it with a set of unified standards. So, the factors, of course, outlined by our respondents centered around air and water pollution, labor rights, climate change mitigation, human rights abuses, equity and inclusion. These factors seem to come up also as part of events. They are based on discussed regulatory development. There is not one day when you open the newspaper and don't see net zero somewhere on the page, net zero impact, net zero effect. And so these factors also, I suspect, are easier to measure in terms of data sets than other softer factors that are not yet fully scientifically measured. So there are, as I mentioned, persisting challenges to ESG, like to considering clear ESG factors. And I think the factors, the challenges are the limited data, the lack of standardization, sometimes transparency as well.
Continuing on the topic of ESG, Associate Managing Director Michael Watt added,
as we saw last year, the perspective from Latin America, as well as a lot of other emerging markets, is that many of these expectations, if they are from a regulatory perspective, they tend to be external. There, of course, have always been for many decades a number of laws that all companies have to consider for sustainability, for labor rights issues, which are the two primary things that we think about in Latin America. as it pertains to ESG. Not much of that has changed, but of course the business environment in the last, say, 12 months has changed where, as I mentioned, the need to find additional investors abroad is important, either because of local economic conditions being challenged for a whole host of reasons, or because of supply chains being disrupted. What that has meant is that some ESG factors tend to be more challenging to assess anytime there's a new business relationship or you're entering into a new market altogether. But it's still important, particularly for seeking outside capital for the region, and how it's continuing to be used is to demonstrate not only to external investors that yes, your organization is following these international standards, but also is being proactive in managing and improving their own reputation for sustainability and human rights concerns.
Sanctions regimes and geopolitical instability from the war in Ukraine will continue to impact ABC programs. Michael Watt shares his perspective.
What is going to matter for the compliance function, not only in the short term, post 100 days for the war, but also into the future, is continued risk assessments, is that as these risks continue to evolve for either their vendors or suppliers or their investors, whether they be due to sanctions or other disruptions in the economy, is that you're still able to keep a good pulse on the risks and the impact to your business.
Associate Managing Director Anthony Ho shares his perspective on sanctions regimes in the Asia-Pacific region.
It's very similar to Michael's response. So definitely an increased responsibility for compliance officers to the risk assessments and the mitigations that would help to mitigate the risk. So certainly the sanctions program had a significant impact to Asia Pacific region because the countries are collectively putting more efforts to closely monitor Russia's international trades. So given the complexities and the rapidly changing environment, there is very likely going to be more controls and monitoring over trades in these areas. So meaning an increased responsibilities to compliance officers and an increased work for the risk assessments.
Manager Anastasia Smiley, who is an expert in the Middle East region, shares her insights on blockchain technology and cryptocurrency impacting compliance professionals in the region.
Certain countries in the Middle East have increasingly sought to position themselves as regional crypto hubs. This includes the UAE, which seems very keen to possess a diverse investment landscape and to be at the forefront of financial innovation from a regional perspective. And in general, I would say that the concept of crypto appears to be increasingly welcome in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, especially amongst the younger populations. And in places like the UAE, but also Bahrain, local governments seem to have increasingly, I guess, very openly given their stamps of approval to crypto firms and the concept of crypto in general by passing and implementing crypto laws and regulations over the last 1 or 2 years. But from a risk perspective, and if we look at the UAE and Dubai in particular, Dubai is a growing crypto hub, but is also to some extent a magnet for the rich and a destination for illicit money. And there is a heightened use of cryptocurrency, across the globe by both genuine investors, but also criminals. And so I think organizations in the UAE and anywhere really should increasingly take cryptocurrency corruption risks into consideration when looking at their ABC programs.
To review the global insights and statistics from Kroll's Global 2022 Anti-Bribery and Corruption Benchmarking Report, or to watch the entire ABC webinar, please visit Kroll.com.